Welcome to the seminar of the Central Asia program at GW. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to this new book launch that we're having today, discussing Pipe Dreams, Water and Empire in Central Asia's Aral Sea Basin. I'm really delighted to have this seminar today because as people working on Central Asia, I think many of us very often find that we are missing some kind of, environmental studies oriented research, that we miss the natural environment being more present in the way we discuss Central Asia. And so I think it's really wonderful to have these new books coming out discussing water issue on the kind of long durée aspect of Central Asia. So once again, congratulations for this publication. So we have these two presenters today. So Maya Peterson, the author, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of California in Santa Cruz, will be briefly presenting the book. And then as a discussant, we have Artemy Kalinovsky, who is Professor of Russian, Soviet, and Post-Soviet Studies at Temple University, but still based in Amsterdam, his previous institutional affiliation. So Maya will first give you the floor for a short presentation, then I will pass the floor to Artemy for a discussion, pass it back to you for some comments, and then for the last half of our seminar, we will open the floor for Q&A. So I invite everybody to ask questions and comment in the chat box, and then I will moderate the discussion during the second half of the seminar. So once again, welcome, and Maya, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Marlene, and thank you to everyone at the Central Asia program for having me. Thanks so much to Artemy for agreeing to be the discussant today, and thank you to everyone in the audience for coming. I'm going to briefly share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see this.
Yes.
So, great, yeah, so that's the cover of the book. And I want to just start by situating us in Central Asia's Aral Sea Basin. And then I'll talk a little bit about the title, Pipe Dreams, and why I chose that. And then we can move on to discussion and Q&A, which I'm really looking forward to. So I'll just give you a kind of overview of the book and the main interventions that I think it is making. So this is a map of Central Asia. Hopefully many of you are familiar with the region already. And the southern part of Central Asia is composed of the Aral Sea Basin. And this is a really arid region. It's a region where water resources are very unevenly distributed. And as Marlene said, understanding the environment of Central Asia is really crucial to understanding its history. So the Aral Sea Basin is a closed basin, and that means that all of the water that comes into the basin comes in the form of precipitation. And much of that precipitation falls in the eastern part of the region, this really mountainous region that you can see, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan today. The water is stored there in the form of snowpack and glaciers, and then in the late spring and the early summer, that snow begins to melt and the water flows down from the mountains, and it flows westward across the region, across these lower lying regions, which are much warmer and also much drier. And it flows in the direction of the Aral Sea. Then it evaporates, and then the cycle begins again. So if we look at the Aral Sea Watershed, I hope you can get a better sense of how that water comes down from the mountains into tributaries that flow into the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. These are the two main rivers of Central Asia, and historically these have found their endpoint in the Aral Sea, which until about the 1960s was considered the fourth largest lake in the world, and that's in terms of surface area. But beginning in around the 1960s, more and more water began to be diverted away from the rivers, so it no longer reached the Aral Sea. And there were two main reasons for the diversions. Number one was irrigation, and this was mostly irrigation for growing cotton. And that this is in the lower lying regions of the Aral Sea Basin. And in the upper regions of the Aral Sea Basin, in the mountains, a lot of water was trapped behind newly constructed large-scale dams for the purposes of creating hydroelectricity. So a lot of water went into reservoirs, and as less and less water reached the Aral Sea, the sea began to very rapidly, the shoreline began to rapidly recede, the sea began to disappear. And you can see this quite well on recent satellite imagery. On the left, you can see the white salty outline of what was the shoreline of the sea in the 1960s, the early 1960s. And on the right side, you can see what has happened as the former seabed has become exposed. Large dust storms of toxic dust have blown across large parts of the region. And that is because in order to grow cotton, the Soviets applied lots of pesticides and fertilizers to the fields. That all those toxins eventually made their way into the Aral Sea, and as the water disappeared, the toxins, the pollutants became more and more concentrated and filtered into that seabed, which now is exposed and is blowing across the region, creating myriad health problems, things like thyroid and respiratory problems, infant mortality, anemia, and other kinds of health issues. So this has very rightly been called one of the greatest environmental tragedies of the 20th century, epitomized by these iconic images with which many of you are probably familiar. These are fishing boats rusting on the bed of the former sea, many, many miles from any water. And so in the book, I talk about how this is usually told as a story of the late 20th century, of the 1960s onward. And while in many ways that is correct, I think that makes it too easy to make this a story about the Soviet Union, to make this a story about problems that happened in the past, that happened somewhere else, and that aren't really that relevant for us today. So the disappearance of the Aral Sea is told as a story of communist gigantomania. That's a love for large-scale projects, infrastructural and development projects that are not sustainable, or it's told as a story of a peculiarly Soviet or communist disregard for the environment and mismanagement of natural resources. And so if we tell the story that way, then we really miss the ways in which the problems of Central Asia as an arid region, the water issues, are ones that face people in arid regions around the world, and will face even more people probably in the future with climate change. And so in the book, I really try to look at the story of the Aral Sea in a much longer historical framework, as Marlene mentioned in the introduction. And so I argue that we really have to go back to the 19th century to understand the logic behind the disappearance of the Aral Sea in the late 20th century. And that's where my title, Pipe Dreams, comes in. So this is the table of contents. The first chapter is about the Russian conquest of large parts of the Aral Sea Basin, starting in the 1860s. Between the 1860s and the 1880s, large parts of Central Asia became part of the Russian Empire and became the Russian province of Turkestan. And because this was such an arid region, the Russians had to figure out how to manage Central Asia's scarce water resources in order to make this new land a productive and profitable colony of the empire. And so the first couple chapters talk about how the Russians really went from thinking about utilizing Central Asia's rivers for navigation and trade purposes to deciding that the best use for water was, excuse me, growing cotton. Using irrigated agriculture, because that's what is really required in Central Asia. And so the pipe in Pipe Dreams tells us that water management is about infrastructure and technologies. It's about pipes and channels and canals and dams. But the dreams part reminds us that there are also underlying visions, underlying dreams about transformation, that determine sort of how that infrastructure gets built and where it gets built and why it gets built. So this decision that Central Asia's water resources were best used to irrigate the deserts and to make the deserts bloom, this is not a particularly Russian vision. In fact, it was a vision, it was a dream that was shared by people around the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in arid regions. And so I call this kind of logic of using water to make wasteland or barren land fertile. I call this the logic of the Irrigation Age. And I took that phrase from a journal that was published in the Western United States. So the Irrigation Age was a time, really the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but onward. I mean, we could say we're maybe still in the Irrigation Age today. This was the philosophy of the Irrigation Age was really rooted in Enlightenment ideas about improvement of land, transforming barren land into agricultural land, ideas about progress. And we see this idea that kind of universal knowledge could be applied mostly by engineers who would become a new professional class in the 19th century to arid lands around the globe. So whether it's the British in places like Mesopotamia and Australia, or the French in North Africa, or the Americans in the Western United States, or the Russians in Central Asia, they all share these particular these same visions, these same fantasies, these same dreams of transformation. And this decision to make Central Asia the cotton-producing colony of the Russian Empire, that lasts beyond the revolution of 1917. So in the last couple chapters, I look at the early Soviet period, the 1920s and 1930s. This was a time when that desire to grow cotton was actually strengthened. And so I look at continuities across 1917, but I also look at differences, and that's something that I hope we can discuss in the discussion and in the Q&A. Lastly, I'd just like to say that pipe dreams, as a title, the phrase pipe dreams in English, a pipe dream is something that is a dream or a goal that is usually seen as unattainable, impossible to realize in practice. And in fact, many of the case studies I look at in the chapters from the late 19th century through the Stalin period are ones that we might consider failures. They did not actually accomplish what they set out to accomplish. And yet, I would say, they really laid the foundation for the more, if we want to call them successful projects, the building of irrigation canals and hydroelectric dams in the post-Stalin period, so the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, that really directly led to the disappearance of the Aral Sea. So that's what I'm really trying to do is put that disappearance of the Aral Sea in this longer historical trajectory on the one hand, these visions and dreams of the Irrigation Age that continue to inform projects, I would say, throughout the Soviet period, but also to place the disappearance in this larger transnational and global context. And then very briefly, the subtitle of the book, Water and Empire in Central Asia's Aral Sea Basin. This logic of the Irrigation Age, we might say, is really an imperialist one. So I'm talking about Euro-American engineers going around the globe, believing that they have this universal knowledge that will transform barren or wastelands, as they thought of them, into productive lands. And so if that logic continues to inform projects in the Soviet period, what does that tell us about the Soviet Union as an empire? And I guess my brief answer is just that it's complicated. So there are a lot of continuities. There also are changes. So for instance, the projects I talk about in chapter 6, such as the project to irrigate the Vakhsh River Valley and the construction of the Great Fergana Canal in 1939, they're qualitatively different from the projects that came before them. And as Artemy's work tells us, the projects that come later in the post-Stalin period are also different. They're different even from the ones in the Stalin period. So things do change. And the Soviet Union is not just a reincarnation of the Russian Empire. But I think taking an environmental approach helps us to see some of the continuities that have shaped the region and that decisions that really continue to shape the region today. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to go into more detail about any of this in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Maya, for this great presentation. I now would like to give the floor to Artemi for discussing the book. Artemi, who published, was that 2018? Your book on a laboratory of socialist development called War Politics and Decolonization in Soviet Tajikistan, which touched some of these issues related to water. Artemi, the floor is yours.
That's right. And as I was writing that book, I was reading Maya's work from her dissertation and the articles that appeared. So I was learning a lot from it even then. And I was very happy to see this book come out. And very happy that we're having this event, even though the book came out in 2019. I think it's a book that deserves publicity and kind of publicity that you can get with a big Zoom meeting. So I'm very glad that we're doing this. Recently, we were having a discussion in the sadly online version of CSS about why environmental history has been kind of why we've been so late as Central Asians to environmental history, considering how central environmental issues were to the politics of the 1980s in the region and all of the debates going on in the lead up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that is now starting to change, and this book is an example of that. In fact, I think it's probably the best study we have of the history behind the region's current environmental problems, and especially those that emerged from the cotton monoculture and the pipe dreams that made it possible. And it's also a book that helps us, I think about Russian colonization of Central Asia in a new way. Peterson frames that story first and foremost as a social and environmental history, not as one focused on the military or on the social history of settlement or on religion. It draws on a very impressive array of archives in Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and the US. I've probably left some out, as well as journals, newspapers, print media, and so on from all over. It's situated, I think, in an intersection of environmental histories of empire and then the recent historiography on the nature of the Russian Empire and early Soviet rule in Central Asia. And I think it gives historians of the Russian Empire and the Soviet period new ways to think about colonial rule, the political economy of empire, and the social history of water usage. It's also one of those books that I think actually shows you what you can do with a particular kind of approach, right? So it's not just kind of a case study, but it really shows you what you can do when you put water front and center. You really start to look at things in a different way. It shows that it's the seeming abundance of water on the one hand, and then the faith in the superiority of Russian and European technology, which convinces administrators, military leaders, and revolutionaries that the region could support vastly expanded agriculture, peasant settlements, and the development of cash crops, especially cotton. All it would take, in theory, was the right technology and political will. In practice, as we know, successive Russian colonizers ran up against environmental problems, and we've seen the effects graphically depicted there in those satellite photographs of the Aral Sea. So what do we start to think about differently in terms of stories that otherwise are familiar? Well, if you take the case of peasant colonization, following the end of serfdom, we know the Russian Empire is confronted with this problem of what do you do with all these peasants occupying scarce arable land. If you put irrigation at the front, at the kind of center of that story, the way that this book does, you're able to see that the decision to recruit and settle peasants in the region is a product of the growing optimism about the region, about the rivers and how they could be used to expand the area under cultivation. It's not about displacing local agriculturalists, although of course their land of pastoralists in particular was limited. But the idea that you could actually expand much further if you knew what to do with these rivers. And so it's this growing enthusiasm for large-scale irrigation projects that makes the land attractive for imperial officials. And that in turn shapes colonization and relations between Russian settlers and local peasants. It also turns the familiar story of cotton on its head, right? So it's again this kind of seeming abundance, if you knew, it's abundant if you know how to make use of it kind of thing, that makes it an attractive area for cotton. And I thought the reframing in chapter 4 of the story of 1916 was also particularly well done. We know this kind of horrific story of the Russian military's response to unrest, which leads to the death of between 150,000 and 270,000 people. And we usually understand this kind of primarily in terms of labor demands or manpower demands for the Russian military. And this book doesn't really say that wasn't important, but puts it in the context of tensions over land and water that had been building for many years. It's not just the colonization, but it's actually the control of water, which creates a lot of the kind of disputes that then break out into in 1916. One of the themes that runs through this book is the relationship between knowledge, power, and irrigation. And I think this is particularly well done. So even if they were impressed with what Central Asians had been able to accomplish with irrigation techniques, Russian officials and engineers generally looked down on the Murabs and others who oversaw the irrigation system as it had existed before colonization. From the Russians' point of view, these individuals had no formal training and lacked the tools to consistently track and report on water usage. But colonial officials, interestingly, remained dependent on these individuals throughout the imperial era, not only for their practical knowledge, which often proves superior to what Europeans are able to accomplish, but their political and social function proves very difficult to supplant. And so without these crucial intermediaries, the Russian administrators would not have been able to mobilize labor for canal digging, nor keep the peace between Russian settlers and local users of water. So that dependence placed limits on Russian imperial power. And then the final two chapters, they cover the Soviet period, as Maya already explained. So what I want to do in conclusion is just to kind of raise some questions, or rather these are questions that in a way are already raised in the book, and I actually do want to push Maya to talk about them maybe a little bit more, to expand on it. The book is very well informed by studies of case studies from outside the Russian and Soviet context. But was there anything to the Russians' claim to being different kinds of imperialists than the British and French rivals? I don't mean in the kind of sense that you'll often hear, but in Russia that we weren't really imperialists, we had a different relationship with Asia. It's very clear that there was plenty that they have in common, but I wonder if there are ways in which that belief actually did lead to some kind of changes and differences. And I'm sorry for the noise from outside, it's rush hour here. How unique were the kind of labor arrangements that emerge in the process of managing irrigations? And how might historians benefit from putting water front and center in other contexts in Central Asian and Soviet history? It's worth noting, by the way, that Sven Beckert's much lauded history of cotton had very little to say about Central Asia. And so I also wonder how might this work change our understanding of cotton's global history. And finally, your kind of discussion of the title just now, the different ways we can understand the term pipe dreams, it also made me think, of course, about the measures that were considered in the late Soviet period in the 70s and early 80s to mitigate the effects of this damage, right? So in particular, this kind of idea of diverting Siberian rivers so that they could replenish the Aral Sea. Is this again kind of a logical kind of continuation of that, or let's say a continuation of that logic that you laid out, or is this again something really qualitatively different coming from yet another kind of technopolitics? But again, congratulations, I guess a little bit belated now, but on such a terrific book. And I encourage everybody who is here, who hasn't read it, to do so as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Artemi. Maya, would you like to take a few minutes to answer some of the comments that were just made and the question asked, and then we will open the floor for Q&A.
Yeah, sure. And hopefully this might answer some of the questions that people have. Thank you so much, Artemi, for such a nice summary of the book and for such good questions. So yeah, there were quite a few. I'll try to go through them. Hopefully I'll hit on all of them, but if I don't answer it in a satisfactory manner, I hope people will continue to push me on it. So Russians as different kinds of imperialists. I mean, I think that one thing that really struck me as I did the research was just how impotent in some ways and how weak the Russian state was in Central Asia. So a lot of these kinds of pipe dreams, these visions for transformation, I mean, they couldn't happen because the Russians had so little idea of what was going on the ground. They had so few people to make things happen on the ground. They had so little capital with which to make, make change. So they depend on entrepreneurs and others. Already in the tsarist period, experts were invited from abroad. And some of these experts actually, at least one of them, Arthur Powell Davis, an American, quite famous American engineer, returned in the Soviet period to serve as a consultant, the main head consultant to the Soviet Cotton Committee. So these were kinds of surprising connections that I found to the American West, that there were these people who were invited in the hopes that they might help some of these projects get off the ground. So I'm not sure that it was so much that the Russians conceived of themselves as different from other imperial powers, but rather that the Russian state was not able to really kind of make the changes that it wanted to. And we see that this is where we see a shift in the Soviet period, is that the Soviet state is much more intrusive into the lives of Central Asians. It's this really kind of mobilizational state that is bent on changing the lives and the landscapes of Central Asia, much in the way that its czarist predecessor said, but also really the lives of Central Asians. And we do see those lives changing. And again, I think Artemi's work really shows how some of the visions for transformation that weren't realized in the 1920s and 1930s by the 1960s and the 1970s really do start to make changes in Central Asia. And I think this can help us to understand why Central Asians themselves might have welcomed some of these large-scale development projects. I think if we're thinking environmentally and we're thinking about the devastating consequences of building dams or diverting rivers for cotton agriculture and doing that poorly. So many of the canals were actually, rather hastily and poorly constructed. This continues throughout the Soviet period. A lot of canals are built without proper drainage systems. This leads to the same kinds of problems happening decade after decade. So land that is supposed to be made fertile, that's supposed to be made productive, is actually ruined because of the collection, the pooling of water, the swamping of that land, or conversely, salinization. So one thing I didn't mention in my short presentation was that in arid regions, there are typically a lot of soluble salts in the soils. And so as Artemi mentioned, this belief that you could just kind of, if you had the water and you moved it to the right place with the right technology, you could grow things. That's really not how it works. And in fact, that's happened around the world. That happened in the American West. It's still happening. If you apply too much water to the surface too quickly, that salt comes up through the soil and it collects on the soil in a hard crust. And in those satellite photos, you could see that the white crusts on the soil. That's the salt coming up to the surface, and then it really is not suitable for growing. And so this was something that people understood, but it made the projects much more difficult, much more expensive. And so often, if they just wanted to accomplish something quite quickly, they would build this irrigation system and not really worry about the sort of the consequences down the road. So I would say, yeah, I don't think the Russians are really all that different, but I just think in Central Asia, at least, it was difficult to carry out a lot of their visions of transformation, and much of that eventually does come to pass in the Soviet period. Labor arrangements, yeah. So this is something that I found quite interesting. I guess, I think in the Tsarist period, in many ways, there isn't even a water law. The Russian Empire doesn't manage to actually enact a law about how Central Asia's water resources will be used until the very eve of the revolution of 1917. And so a lot of labor arrangements were really just kind of based on local practices. And this changes in the Soviet period. We start to see projects that resemble the kinds of large-scale projects that are being carried out in other parts of the Soviet Union. So I look at this project in the 1930s to irrigate the Vakh River Valley. It's very similar to, for instance, Stephen Kotkin's descriptions of Magnitogorsk, Magnetic Mountain, the steel plant in the Urals. But then what I found really interesting was the emergence by the end of the 1930s. So like many other projects in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, Vakhstroy, this project to irrigate the Vakh River Valley, really becomes a project that's mostly using forced labor by the end of the 1930s because people didn't want to go. This is a project on the border of Tajikistan and Afghanistan. It's really far away from the rest of the Soviet Union. People didn't want to go to Tajikistan. And once they were there, they didn't want to stay there because the project, like so many other Soviet projects, didn't have adequate housing, didn't have adequate food, didn't have adequate supplies. And so people, as long as they could, would move on to other construction projects in other parts of the Soviet Union. But at the very end of the 1930s, the construction of the Great Fergana Canal is this completely different kind of project, which mobilizes collective farm workers, so tens of thousands of people, to come with their hoes and with their shovels, with the traditional tools of irrigation construction in Central Asia, and to dig this enormous canal, hundreds of kilometers long, in just about the space of 1 month. And this project is touted as this completely new kind of socialist labor, that this is a kind of labor that is impossible to realize in any other part of the world. It's only made possible by collectivization, by the ability to mobilize collective farmers. But the idea is that Central Asian people are finally getting the water that they have dreamed of for centuries, so that this is an idea that comes from the people. And so these are called people's construction projects, or narodnie stroiki. And it's something that we see then utilized again and again in other parts of the Soviet Union. So also for other hydraulic projects, but other kinds of projects as well. These people's construction projects continue to crop up. And it's this idea that the state is making possible a new kind of labor and making possible new kinds of outcomes that were never possible before. So it's only the Soviet state that is able to bring water to the Central Asian people. But kind of ironically, it's not through fancy technology. It's not through, the latest irrigation or engineering techniques. It's through mobilizing sort of the spirit of the people to bring themselves the water that they've always wanted. And there's a lot of talk about liberation and fulfilling these age-old dreams. But to me, if you're a collective farmer, do you really have a choice about whether or not you want to go out in the hot August sun and dig a canal for the state? No, you probably don't. So for me, it's this kind of interesting blurring of lines between free labor and forced labor. It's not forced labor. It's not gulag labor. It's collective farmers. But on the other hand, it is not exactly free labor. And in the Central Asian case, what I find particularly interesting is I think this is the first time when this kind of large-scale project is sort of sold to the people as an example of hashar. And hashar was this indigenous institution in Central Asia whereby people would pledge their labor every year to public works projects. So irrigation canals were often built through this kind of voluntary, but not really voluntary. It's your duty to the state to provide this labor, to provide the tools once a year. And so the Soviet state says, you know, this is something that Central Asians already do. So they love it, right? This is their thing. But in the Soviet version, it's made into a kind of holiday. So if you see photos from any of the people's construction projects in Central Asia from this period, from the 1930s and 1940s, you see not just people, these, you know, amazing, almost, it looks like cinematography, you know, these vast tableaus of people with their hoes digging. It's not just the people's labor, but you also have dancers and you have musicians and you have everyone celebrating, and they're celebrating the water coming as though it's this, you know, this holiday. And what I found interesting is that idea of hashar as a kind of cover for forced labor still exists in the region today. And again, I think Artemi's work really kind of, you know, helps to bridge where my work leaves off in the early 1940s and the current day. In his work, he talks about the emergence of child labor in the cotton fields. And so there is this idea, you know, in Uzbekistan still today, and things have gotten a little better with the regime change in recent years, but you still get news reports that although the state is saying that labor in the cotton fields is voluntary, or, you know, will be compensated, that local and regional leaders are still invoking this idea of hashar as, you know, this is a reason that, you know, university students or members of this organization or group have to do some work in the cotton fields. We're still getting reports of that. And so that's a kind of...
I propose we slowly move to the Q&A.
Yeah, sure.
Because there are plenty of questions.
Okay.
And
Yes,
and maybe some question will
I'll try to answer the rest of Artemi's questions in the,
yeah, it could be an ongoing conversation for several hours, but there was a lot of good questions that are going in different directions, asking you to look at something more comparative, to more comparative in time, more comparative in space. So I will try to organize them the best I can. So we had questions about your research as a kind of tool for comparison with other projects. We had a question, for example, telling us that the Aral Sea canals were seen as an inspiration in Mongolia for what could be done in the Gobi Desert. And so the question from Kenneth is about, have you seen other examples on how the Aral Sea project was held up as a model to be followed by other socialist countries? And another similar question about how your research is also give us tools of comparison with other development hydropower station projects going on in Central Asia along the Ili River and the impact on the Balkhash Lake. So if you could develop briefly on this kind of comparative aspect, and then we will move to another set of questions.
Okay, so I mean, I don't actually know anything about the Mongolian case. I haven't read anything or heard about it, but it's quite interesting. And it makes sense to me that what happens in Central Asia in the Soviet period then serves as a model for other surrounding regions, because what the Soviets were doing was already inspired by similar projects that were being carried out by European and American imperialists in other parts of the world. So I think it's all part of the same logic. And I would say the same for hydropower stations along the Ili River. I mean, this is all ideas about, you know, how water should best be used go back to, again, this logic that I talk about emerging from the 19th century. I didn't talk as much about hydropower because the Irrigation Age, I think, is more relevant for what we see in Central Asia in the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. But hydropower is there too. And so, and that's a tension. So if you trap a lot of water for hydropower, you know, then there's less water to go to the fields. So they certainly, the tsarist engineers were already interested in developing hydropower. And in chapter 4, where I look at the Chu River Valley, so on the border of what's now Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. It's actually kind of right outside of the technical Aral Sea Basin, but it's very much influenced by the decision to use water in places like the Fergana Valley for cotton instead of food. So there's this idea that, well, Central Asia needs food, and the Chu River Valley was going to be developed as the grain growing part of Central Asia, and it was going to provide food to the cotton growing regions. And part of that project was also a hydropower dam. And certainly today, there are tensions between the water that's used for hydropower by upstream nations like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. If they use too much water for hydropower, that means less water for the farmers downstream in, you know, what are now separate countries, places like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. So there are actually tensions in the region today. But I would say they're all part of that same logic that if you have water resources, they should be used. There's actually an English term, and I haven't really been able to find equivalents for it in Russian, but it's called the duty of water, which means that water has a duty to people. Water has a kind of burden that it can and that it should bear. And so this was that same logic that is informing, I think, all of these projects, is that if you have water resources, you should use them. And depending on what kind of river it is and where it is, it might be better used for irrigation or it might be better used for hydropower. But I think that this is very much still the way people think about it. Otherwise, they think about water flowing into the ocean as going to waste. And that's very much a logic that exists. I'm in California now. That's very much the prevalent logic here. If you drive through the agricultural regions, and so California is like Central Asia, it's arid. Like Central Asia, the water resources are very unevenly distributed. So they're more in the north and in the east, the mountainous regions, less in the warm places that are good for growing, agricultural crops. And so if you drive through the Central Valley, which produces a lot of food for the United States, you see signs that say, is growing crops a waste of water? And that's pushing back against people who think that water should be used for other purposes, particularly environmentalists who think that water should be used, that we should undam the rivers so that the fish can swim upstream, and we should protect our scenic rivers for recreation and for other purposes.
Thank you so much, Maya. There is another set of questions asking you to look on the 19th century and early Soviet period. So one question is about the role of water in Russian imperial imagination, as you have this tradition in Russia to parallel the expansion into the continent, the steppe continent being similar to the oceanic expansion of Western European countries. So were there this language of civilization going through irrigation, and were there other type of narrative around water that were developed by the Russian Empire in the 19th century as a way to engage in a kind of broader imperial dynamic? That's one question. And the second question, which is a classic and central one, is about, based on your own research and your angle, do you see the Soviet Union as being an imperial construction? Do you think that imperial is the terminology that should be used? I mean, you have both what the Soviets were doing on the ground and the narrative, so ideology that they were bringing to Central Asia. And in that case, would you use imperial as a way to describe the Soviet experiment in Central Asia? Let's take these two questions and then we will move to another set.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'm not sure I have an answer for water in the Russian imperial imagination. I mean, I think one of the things that I noticed quite quickly was that water resources in Central Asia are very different from water resources in what we might call, Russia proper, sort of the central Russian regions. For Russians, water, there are all these great rivers in Russia and in Siberia, and those had traditionally been the highways of Russia, particularly before the building of the railroads in the late 19th century. So for navigation purposes, for trade purposes, Russia's rivers were extremely important for mobility and for connection with other places. And so I think their first instinct when coming to Central Asia was to use Central Asia's rivers as waterways for transportation. There were a lot of visions in the late 19th century about how trade could be funneled from China and from India through Central Asia and up into Europe via Russia, that this would be a really good thing for the Russian Empire. But what they quickly found was that Central Asia's rivers were very different from the rivers farther north. They're much shallower, and they carry very large loads of silt from up in the mountains. And this means that they change their course quite often. They're not very easy to navigate. And this also led to the problem of the Aral Sea. So even if you can navigate the entire length of the Amu Darya, you end up in the Aral Sea, which is a lake in the middle of a desert, and that's not very useful. So in the first chapter, I actually look at these plans to try to divert the waters of the Amu Darya away from the Aral Sea and into the Caspian Sea. The Volga River flows into the Caspian Sea. So this would create this great waterway going through Central Asia that would connect Russia to the riches of Asia through Central Asia. But this plan is abandoned. And again, there's this turn, as I mentioned, to the idea that actually the water resources would be better used for irrigation rather than navigation. So, and I think part of the problem for the Russians is that they're used to having too much water, especially engineers who are trained in places like St. Petersburg, which is a city reclaimed from marshes. So coming to a place like Central Asia, the water resources were just completely different, and dealing with arid regions was something that they were not used to. So I don't think we can really talk about kind of one Russian imperial imagination, because trying to transplant ideas from Russia to Central Asia really didn't work. So I guess that would be my answer for that. And then the Soviet Union as an imperial power, I think, and I tried to mention this briefly in my presentation, I do think that if we take an environmental point of view and we look at what happens to Central Asia over the course of the Soviet Union, yes, there are a lot of improvements in people's lives. There are new opportunities for people. People become more literate. People have more job opportunities than they had before. But you also have these kind of devastating environmental effects. And Artemy also really talks about this very nicely in his work. You have this kind of sense of disparity by the late Soviet period, where Central Asians, yes, they're producing for the Soviet Union, but they're not getting as much in return. A lot of consumer goods, just basic things like running water are not available to many Central Asians, even in the late Soviet period. And so there is this sense that among Central Asian elites and even among ordinary people, that somehow they're missing out on the prosperity of the Soviet Union, that they're producing all of this, but they're not getting enough in return. And that does kind of lead to a feeling of being a colony. And so I would say, the Soviet Union is not just another empire. And yet I think, especially if we look at things like Central Asians being forced to produce a lot of cotton rather than food, or even by the late Soviet period, they're also supposed to provide food, so fruits and vegetables for the rest of the Soviet Union, but there isn't enough water to do it, and they're under increasing pressure to produce more and more and more, and they don't feel that they're getting enough. So in that sense, I think, there are lots of different ways that we could look at the question of the Soviet Union as an empire, but if we look at, if we take an environmental point of view, and if we put water at the center, I think the continuities and the resemblances to empire are much stronger, particularly in the Central Asian case. Also, just kind of these disparate health outcomes and things that I've talked about, that people have really suffered as a result of these programs in ways that might not be tolerated closer to Moscow.
Thanks, Maya. Another set of questions is about the kind of the regional aspect of the Aral Sea management. So Jeff is asking, for example, what about the kind of trans-republican aspect of the Aral Sea transformation. How did Republican leader in Soviet time cooperated or not cooperated, and how do you think this has impacted water management in the region? And another topic partly linked to that is what about the relationship between regional irrigation system and land tenure in Central Asia, Soviet time, but also today with the partial privatization of land in Central Asia. So if you could articulate both this kind of political economy, this kind of two political economy aspect would be great.
Yeah, so there were conflicts in the Soviet period between different republics over the use of water resources. In the Tsarist period, as I mentioned, this was all one colony, the province of Turkestan. But in the Soviet period, it's divided into what become the 5 Central Asian republics that exist today. And so already in the Soviet period, there were squabbles over resources, over who was getting more engineers and more assistance for their projects, because the water resources themselves, of course, crossed the Republican boundaries. They had nothing to do with the boundaries, the political boundaries were drawn on putatively ethnic lines, not adhering to any kind of natural watershed lines. So you do get some conflicts. There's nothing, it's a competition for resources that we see, I think, in other parts of the Soviet Union as well. So there's nothing that's particularly noteworthy. But for the most part, it was easier to cooperate because they were all part of the Soviet Union ultimately, even if they felt as though there were some kind of discrepancies. Kyrgyzstan felt that Uzbekistan was getting more aid from Moscow or more support for its projects. And then, so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, though, you then have the fracturing of the region into independent countries. And because they had all also had a shared energy grid in the Soviet period, this also becomes an issue. I mentioned there are these tensions between the upstream countries that are pushing for the construction of more hydroelectric dams because they don't have the same kinds of energy resources that the downstream countries do. So places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan have oil and gas reserves that they can use for energy, but really the main resources that these upstream nations have is water. And water and oil are not, they can't be traded for the same, they don't have the same value on the market, although there is now an emerging water futures market, which will be kind of interesting to keep an eye on. So there was actually a lot of, there have been times when the dams in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are supposed to release water to go downstream, and it's being hoarded for the purposes of producing energy in those upstream countries. So there have been, again, tensions between the republics, and people have predicted that there will be, there could even be open conflict over these water resources, but that hasn't actually come to pass. For the most part, Central Asian leaders have been able to come together and have realized that cooperation is ultimately in their best interest. And, I don't think that that we're going to see really open conflict. If we're looking at the Aral Sea region, for a while, Uzbekistan was not really part of the efforts to, there have been individuals and organizations trying to save the Aral Sea, but the Uzbek government was kind of absent. But more recently, in recent months, they've been partnering with the World Bank to try to restore the Aral Sea region, if not the sea itself. And Kazakhstan has actually done a good job of preserving a part of the Aral Sea, now called the North Aral Sea, that's no longer disappearing. They've even reintroduced fish. And so that's been a kind of a very small success story. So that's the Trans-Republican water management. And then water management and land tenure. Yeah, I mean, that you cannot separate the water from the land. So anything about water is also about land. And I guess that gets to Artemi's question about cotton too. For a long time, I was kind of insistent that I was doing a history of water and not a history of cotton, but there's no way to separate the two. this is ultimately a story about land tenure and about land use as well. And today, I think the different republics have adopted different approaches to how to continue to manage land and water resources. So there's been more privatization and decentralization in Kazakhstan, for instance. It's remained much more centralized in Uzbekistan. So in Uzbekistan, it's much more similar to the kinds of collective farms producing cotton and wheat, and to meet particular quotas. You still see that in Uzbekistan today, that people really don't have a lot of control over how water resources are being used and what kinds of crops are being grown. Again, we might see that starting to shift a little bit, but it's different in different parts of the region.
Wonderful. And then maybe very briefly, last question to kind of open up toward the future. One question about the role of global warming in accelerating already existing trend. And the last one that I will just mention, because I found that a really good point about the idea of juxtaposing pipe dreams with belt dreams of the China Belt and Road project in the region. I don't know if you have things to comment on the second one, but just a few words about the role of global warming, I think.
Yeah, I mean, global warming is certainly a huge problem, particularly for arid regions going forward. We don't really know what water resources are going to look like. And I think this brings in Artemi's question about, in the Soviet period already, there was a lot of discussion of kind of, how do we address the lack of water in Central Asia? Because even though it had seemed abundant enough to support all this kind of development and settlement, it became very clear, and the disappearance of the Aral Sea was just kind of the most obvious example, but that these water resources are really finite. And as I mentioned, Central Asian leaders were under a lot of pressure to produce more and more cotton each year, to produce more food. And so one of the very popular ideas then became bringing water from where it's very abundant in Siberia to Central Asia by creating these enormous canals, by diverting water from the Siberian rivers and bringing it to the deserts of Central Asia. This was, of course, made some sense. Of course, it's a crazy dream on the one hand, but it was all one country. It's still raised occasionally today. The former mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, actually suggested to Putin that Russia could sell its water to Central Asia because it has all this water in the Siberian rivers. But it also met with a lot of protests, particularly from environmentalists and Russian nationalists in the 1970s and 1980s. I would say that this is really, it's still something that people think about today as perhaps a way to solve the region's water problems. Well, if there's climate change and there's not enough water, we could still bring the water from elsewhere. And we might say this is kind of crazy. And Artemi asked, is this a specific kind of vision that's maybe, specific kind of technocratic vision? I would say these kinds of river diversion projects actually, as crazy as they may sound, and even with the rise of environmentalism, they haven't gone away. China is doing a north-south water diversion project as we speak. And there has actually been a plan in the United States that was first devised in the 1950s that continues to crop up. It was proposed many, many times to each successive presidential administration. It's sort of receded a bit in recent years, but I think it hasn't entirely gone away. And this is a project to divert water from Alaska and northern Canada through the arid parts of the western United States and actually into northern Mexico. So these kinds of continental water diversion schemes as a kind of technocratic fix for our problems of the future, for things like climate change, I think are very dangerous because there are all kinds of other problems that will come from that kind of solution that we can't even foresee. And as for the Belt and Road, lots of people ask me about that. I haven't really seen a connection between the Belt and Road Initiative and hydraulic projects, but certainly the Chinese are quite interested in these projects, and they're interested in getting water from Kazakhstan, for instance. So I think it is something to keep our eye on.
Thank you, Maya, so much. We could continue the discussion. There were several other questions we didn't have time to ask. I apologize for the author. I invite them to write to you directly to continue the conversation. Yes. And related to China, just little publicity that in 10 days on the 25th, we will have 2 book launches, both discussing China Silk Road for Central Asia. So one book by Daniel Markey, China's Western Horizons, and one book by Tim Winter, Geopolitical Power. So I invite you to join us on March 25th. Once again, Maya, thank you so much. Congratulations for the book. Artemi, thank you so much for great comments on that book. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the audience. And then hope everybody is safe and to see you very soon on another online event. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you. So nice to see everyone.
Well,
and
great.
please
Thank
email
you.
me
Bye-bye.
if your question wasn't answered. I'll be happy to talk.
Bye-bye.